Max, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Carey.
Yeah. This is going to be a fun conversation. So I don't think I've ever had anyone from Bloomberg on before, but you cover tech for Bloomberg and have done that for a while. I'd love to know, was this just like a random assignment? Like as a journalist, it's, hey, you got tech? Or have you been interested in this from the time you were little?
Well, it's maybe a little of both. So I'm 39, and kind of growing up, got kind of, sort of that puts me right in the age where I was like sort of growing up just as the internet was becoming a thing. So I remember the world before the internet, but I also I got to kind of live all that change in a really intimate way. And when I was a kid, I was really interested in computers, and I even was kind of clumsily like teaching myself how to code. And I was like, really, really interested in the internet, read Wired magazine, and then then kind of lost interest in tech, and went to college and got interested in becoming a journalist, and wasn't particularly thinking about this as a journalistic path, but then basically wound up at a business magazine called Inc. Inc. is basically a magazine for entrepreneurs, I think basically because I was like the young one, they had me cover tech. And at the time, this is like 2005, it was kind of a nadir for Silicon Valley and for tech, where these companies had, been very hot, in the 90s. And basically the rest of the world had sort of decided, oh my God, we were totally wrong about this. And all these businesses are sort of stupid, and we got to get back to basics. But of course, there was still stuff happening there. So it was kind of this weird side thing that, because I was young and junior, I got to, I got to write about or had to write about. And as a result, I got to spend time with all of these people who are now famous, including, Elon Musk and Jack Dorsey. I mean, I remember when like Jack Dorsey was like, working out of this tiny, the founder of Twitter, or former CEO of Twitter, working out of this kind of sad little cubicle thing. And, anyways, so little space that like when we had the interview, it was like, in a park while he ate a burrito, or, and of course, and one of those people I encountered during that time was Peter Thiel. I think I interviewed him the first time because I was writing a profile of Elon Musk, who was this kind of weird guy who was, starting an electric car company, and it didn't seem very realistic. And he also had this rocket thing. And anyway, and then of course, fast forward at 15 years, that little industry that was kind of a sideline, in 2005, and that, was not taken very seriously, by some of the folks, where I worked at Inc. at the time, or by anyone really, of course, is now kind of this, economic and, cultural force, maybe the most important, economic and cultural force, entire world. And I think that story of how that happened is really amazing. And it's kind of like what I think I'm covering, both at Bloomberg and to some extent, in this book.
Yeah, The Contrarian, which is really a biography of Peter Thiel, right? So, and we'll get into some of that, but it is interesting. One of the phrases that's come up over the last couple of years has been unintended consequences. So you go back to those early days, Twitter. You remember it pre-Twitter, I think 05, 06, when it was an idea and a joke, and you used to have to text in your status updates. Do you remember that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
that was a weird thing.
No,
right?
no, and
but
the big issue with Twitter, right, was that people didn't have unlimited texting plans. So like if you got too into it, you'd rack up a huge bill, and it would become unusable. It's kind of funny now that our feeds are just, it's like a deluge now of information. It's kind of funny to imagine that coming through SMS, but yeah, that's how it was.
Yeah, that is interesting. You tell your kids, well, there were limits to text messages. Like I had 100 text messages included in my plan. And they're like, what are you even talking about? They have no idea, right? Which is fun. But unintended consequences. So when you go back, because now everyone's talking about big tech and the big five or the big six, and, the problems with that, and, comparisons to really what happened even 100 and some odd years ago with the big oil companies and the antitrust suits that came up and the antitrust actions that, pardon me, the first Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, took. Similar vibes today. But when you go back to those early days, did you have any inkling that this is where we would end up 17 years later?
No. And I don't think that many people who are inside the industry did. And I'm sure we could go back and find critics, right? Because there are always people who, whatever. We live in a, society with lots of different opinions. I'm sure there were people who were pointing it out. But it's certainly something I didn't feel because, and I don't think, the folks who are now kind of at the eye of the storm who are being criticized, really had any notion that this was the trajectory. I mean, they felt like outsiders, right? And they were kind of revolutionaries who were, and I would put, Thiel in this group. I would put Mark Zuckerberg in this group, or Dorsey, Elon Musk. A lot of these folks, felt like they were, outsiders, and they had no power, and certainly no cultural salience or anything like that. And that's, I think, part of the reason why there was so little thought given to kind of like, well, are our lives really going to be better if we're spending 8 hours a day or more, staring at a smartphone screen, or are our lives going to be any better if, we have this like, direct connection to the viewpoints of, hundreds of millions of people or billions of people all over the world. Like, so, cause really like the networks were so much smaller and just, it just seemed like, and I think this was what was at play, right? If you back then said, hey, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg, you should be, growing in this kind of like imperialistic way, because if you succeed, you'll have 3 billion users and you won't have enough employees to control the content that's coming out in these corners of the world that are really unstable. And you might even cause like genocides if things get out of control. I mean, I don't think he would have had any idea how to respond to that.
He would have been laughed out of the room.
Because what you're describing, from their point of view was success. Like having 3 billion users, it's hard when you have a tiny company and no profits to speak of. It's hard to see like that really as a warning. It's more like that's a goal. And I think that's kind of exactly what happened. And I think and I get into this some in the book. I think Peter Thiel helped create an ideology, with Zuckerberg and others that kind of both made that growth possible, in terms of creating a playbook that sort of showed like here's how these tech companies can grow like really quickly. But of course, as I argued in the book, I think that philosophy has some limitations, and in particular some limitations around ethics and around impact, which really I don't think were considered that deeply at the time.
Yeah, so you do talk, the contrarian, and you've written about this too on your beat as well for Bloomberg and other places, but there is this widespread conversation now that you drill down on between ideology and Silicon Valley. And it's easy to think of tech as neutral, right? And I'm not sure, back to Unintended Consequences, that in the early days, Zuck was thinking, oh, we're going to be a factor in a presidential election, or
right.
I'm going to have my politics become an issue. That was like what he did, but he was building this neutral platform. But can tech, and let's think about this not so much as an origin, but even now, and I think you make this argument in the book, can tech be designed with ideology in mind?
Well, I think there's this, there's a sort of thing you hear in Silicon Valley, and that frankly has existed in the tech industry going back like generations, right? That tech is kind of, apolitical, right? And I think that's a pretty comfortable place to be, if you're a technologist, right? Because politics is messy, and it can, if you're in business, it can of course, like lead to regulation and lead to you having to pay like more in taxes or being hauled in front of Congress or whatever. So that's a position that I think had certain advantages, and also had some kind of like, I think that's a nice way to see yourself. It's nice to see yourself as building something that is sort of outside of ideology. But I don't think tech, I don't think really anything can kind of exist in this world, outside of politics and outside of ideology, because of course, like we all bring, our biases to anything we do, including when we're writing software and how we design these apps and things like that. And sometimes, of course, like the saying like, "Oh, I'm just apolitical," can be a political statement, because if somebody is, or if somebody's saying, "Hey, would you like to provide some food aid to these like poor people," and you say, "Well, I'm apolitical," right? Like that you're kind of making a political statement. And I think sometimes tech has done that. I think it's really it's a tricky question because the notion of technology platforms, Facebook and Twitter and so on, as these bastions of free speech, like it's really like compelling and important. And I think by creating these big platforms that have brought a lot of viewpoints out into the world, like they've done a lot of good, and they've opened people's eyes to things. But of course, like there's just always going to be limits, and it's hard to figure out where first of all, who should be the ones to police the platforms? Do we want to trust Facebook? Do we want to trust the government? Do we want to trust some combination of the two? And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, and we're trying to kind of figure that out. And depending on kind of like which political persuasion you talk to, they'll come up with different answers. But I think there's a kind of a growing awareness, I'd say like on both sides of the political spectrum, at least in the United States, that like these tech companies have a great deal of power over our speech, and ultimately over like our ideas and the things that we think. And we probably need, I don't know if it's creating limitations, but at least creating some sort of framework to think about, do we want to put limits on that power? I don't know what the answer to that question is.
Yeah, so let's go back to, I don't think anybody really wants to, but the 2016 or 2020 election, the US presidential election. The power of tech did play a big role. And I think it kind of shocked everyone at the time for how big, particularly in 2016, tech played. And you cover that. So the algorithm, for example, you cover in your book, like elevated certain posts above others. Then we got into censoring in 2020, to massive amounts of tech money that actually poured into certain candidates. So it's not just, oh, this is my platform elevating something that may be a bot or spam or false news or whatever, fake news. But then you've also got, you say, Peter Thiel really being the contrarian conservative ideologue in Silicon Valley, getting behind Donald Trump, et cetera. Talk about how those influences converge, because I think all of us were taken by surprise by it, at least the first time around.
Yeah, and I certainly was.
Yeah.
So there's sort of two dimensions to this. One is, these technologies as distribution platforms for ideas, right? And the sort of shift of campaigning from being something that's playing out in mass media and canvassing and things like that to, and of course those things are still important, but there's this new thing called social media that I think a lot of people became much more keenly aware of in 2016 and the aftermath. Now the funny thing is, right? Trump, I think, used social media very, in a very effective way, Trump and his supporters. Yeah. And I think
astutely.
Yeah, 100%. And they both in terms of like how they literally were using it and how Trump was communicating and his tweets. And, there are aspects of his personality that I think were sort of perfectly sort of pitched to that thing. And there was also an ability to sort of read the room, or, just a lot of like real combination of, I think, creativity and good timing. But the funny thing is, like, you go back 4 years earlier, the Obama campaign actually pioneered a lot of the techniques that Trump's campaign ended up using, the kind of like micro targeting and this attempt to like slice and dice audiences and be able to target messages to specific people. That stuff was kind of in the water. I think Trump was just kind of using a lot of these tactics that had already been developed, but then putting on top of that just a personality and a persona and kind of an understanding of the medium that maybe Obama and his folks like didn't quite have. Now, and that's a tech story, and that's one where I think, Trump and also Trump's ability, with the help of folks like Peter Thiel, to push Facebook and the social media outlets to regulate speech in the way they wanted it to be regulated, played a role. But a lot of 2016, I think, was also just a more conventional campaign. It was a campaign where we had some new power players. So I think social media played a role, but I think the tech industry, and in particular Thiel, played a role in helping Trump be seen as competent and a worthy candidate at a time when, even when among Republicans, like, he was this, outsider, and there were all these never Trumpers, back in. So the way that I got interested in this is that Thiel, stands up in the summer of 2016 and endorses Trump for president in prime time, right before Trump delivers his remarks at the RNC. And to those of us like following tech, and in fact, to a lot of friends of, people who were friends with Peter Thiel, had followed him for a long time, it was crazy because, the tech industry was in so many ways, 180 degrees from Donald Trump, right? Peter Thiel is somebody who's like super interested in the future. He's a futurist. He wants to make things happen faster, sooner now. He's an immigrant. He's gay. And he's backing a candidate, right, who is in some ways hostile to all of those things. I mean, Trump ran kind of as a reactionary, right? Where we want to make things like, the way they were, before, the Democrats or whatever ruined the country. And of course he ran as this kind of like, a hardline immigration candidate, which again, totally 180 degrees from kind of what conventional wisdom was in Silicon Valley. And so I think Thiel's endorsement, was surprising and also made a lot of people maybe think a little bit differently about Trump. When I talked to folks in the Trump campaign while I was working on this book, they found Thiel was really valuable to them because they did not have a lot of kind of like mainstream business folks who were supporting Trump's campaign, right? It was a lot of like, Trump had some business leaders, but they tended to be kind of from the real estate world or entertainment or these areas that are not necessarily seen as the most like reputable, not a lot of like card-carrying Davos attendees were backing Trump at that point. And here's Peter Thiel, who is both, very conservative, but also totally in that club, right? He is on the Facebook board. He's somebody who built this kind of like new economy, and he's saying Trump is okay. And I think that made a huge difference. And then the other thing that happened, at the RNC that I think was pretty significant is, Thiel gave a speech where he talked about, going back to the future and kind of endorsing Trump's like I said, reactionary vision. But he also said, I'm proud to be gay and I'm proud to be an American. And that was Thiel is somebody who's like really private, so that was kind of a big deal for him, I think, personally. But it was also a big deal for the Republican Party. That was the first time, at a Republican convention, somebody had done that, and Thiel didn't get booed. It wasn't awkward. They all cheered, and so I think it created this sense. Now, however fleeting, I think a lot of these folks ended up being pretty disappointed in Trump in the long run, but that Trump maybe wasn't as polarizing as kind of he was being presented, and that he also was maybe more competent than he was being presented. So I think like those things, those are just more like old school, kind of like conventional, power, money, politics stuff also played a role in addition to the like algorithmic, micro targeting dimension of the election.
Well, it almost feels like the early 20th century, the robber baron era, where you had guys like Henry Ford and Rockefeller and Carnegie who would lobby Washington, but were also subject to regulation. And It almost feels like we're in that moment again, right? Where the very people like, Zuck gets subpoenaed to Congress and he has to testify, and Jack Dorsey does, and I'm sure Peter Thiel has at one point or another. And you're in that, but that hasn't really happened in our lifetime at the level it's happening now, at least not in my lifetime. Am I missing something, or are we just in one of those eras?
No, I think you're, and there have been books written about this that, people have compared. I think Tim Wu, wrote a book of comparing the response to the telecom monopoly to the internet, right? And I think that's probably a good analogy. And kind of in that view, right, there's eventually going to be basically the government will eventually kind of defang these big tech companies, and that'll eventually allow for a new generation of players to come on the scene. I think that's if you want to live in a pluralistic world with competition and stuff, then I think that's what we'd probably be hoping for, right? Is that in the long run, these big companies will face real competition, upstarts that will challenge them in some way that we cannot devise or whatever. But I do think that kind of modern robber baron analogy is pretty useful, and I also think it's probably important to say that a lot of these tech guys have a view of monopoly that is pretty out of like the mainstream, at least out of how like mainstream capitalists, citizens in capitalist democracies view it.
How's it different?
So Thiel wrote a book, called 0 to 1, and it's basically like a business book, but it also has people who are fans of his read sort of deep meaning into it. It's a really kind of is a business book that maybe depending on your point of view doubles as kind of like a life philosophy type thing. But in the book, he argues that tech companies are sort of different from other businesses in that, they are network businesses. And with a network business, basically you have a winner and everybody else, right? You can't have a million different Facebooks because there's going to be one network that is ultimately going to win. And therefore, the goal of these companies is monopoly. And that, anyone who says otherwise is just a phony or a liar or something else like that. And I think that and like there are different ways you could read that. Like maybe that's like a subtle critique of these companies. He's sort of saying the quiet part out loud. But either way, like I think that Zuckerberg and many of these other companies have really, explicitly sought monopoly. And I think that's something that maybe hasn't happened for a long time. Although I think from like the Peter Thiel view, he would just sort of say, well, all business leaders have been doing that. They just haven't been like willing to admit it. But I think we have to figure out a way, especially with tech, to if you want to have competition, you have to find a way to somehow undermine that because the observation from Thiel that these are networks and they're dominated by a single player, it feels like it's factually true. So it may require either new tech or some kind of novel regulations to kind of get around that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I'm sure they're not the first business people to think monopoly, but nobody has really achieved that in our lifetime. This has been,
right.
I grew up in an era where they were unbundling all that stuff, where they were deregulating it, where there was power, and this is sort of, become unbridled, and now it's impacting all of us. What do you, because I want to get on to other aspects of tech, but when you think there's another election right around the corner, there always is, right? Sadly.
Yeah.
How much do you think elections are impacted by algorithms and that kind of thing, based on your perspective as a reporter from what you've seen? And obviously a lot of deep research. Like, to what extent do you think there is, I don't know whether the question is a bias, but just, clearly this is a factor, but how would you define that?
I think that we still have free will, thankfully. and
we still have agency.
While there is like, I do think these technologies, Facebook in particular, have the prospect to, affect people and influence people in ways that are profound and important. And, it's people talk about, it's kind of like a mind control machine or something like, right. Like they help shape our perceptions. But of course, mass media has done that too. So like, I don't know how different that is. But what I do think is that because these tools are very powerful and because the companies that are running them do not really seem to have their arms around that power, like that creates a lot of potential for manipulation. And I think that's what is kind of troubling when you look at the history of 2016 and 2020, right? Where it was kind of clear, even in 2016, even before the election, that there were sort of bad actors and there was kind of like junky, the term fake news, right, has become, it's like, I don't know, it's sort of like a radioactive word, but anyway, there was a false news and basically lies that were being pushed across the platform, and like many people believed them, and that the company Facebook kind of responded, right, by like denying it and kind of like, just like slow walking like any criticism and any scrutiny. And that's kind of happened over and over again over the last 5 years. And I think the result of that is it just creates like vulnerabilities where like somebody who is either smart enough or kind of like unethical enough can kind of potentially manipulate these platforms in ways that like we don't understand. And then you have situations like, where you have this, like, just talk about what's going on today. I mean, you have this gigantic, anti-vax movement amid a public health emergency, or you have, QAnon, rising, at a time when the election is kind of like under dispute or whatever. Like, I just think it creates a lot of uncertainty and undermines trust and things like that in a bad way. But like, I don't think we are enthralled to these platforms, and I don't think we should mystify them and ascribe like more power to them than they actually have. I mean, they're like information platforms, just like the mass media, although unlike the mass media, they're basically totally unregulated, and so you can get really funky stuff.
Yeah. Well, we could spend a lot of time there. I think I'm going to move on. I want to talk to you about some of the things you cover in the book, and then some general questions about tech in the future, because we have a lot of leaders who are navigating tech right now, and we all have opinions about it. But you cover growth hacking in the book, and that was something. Peter Thiel is one of the co-founders of PayPal, and you talk about growth hacking. What is that as a concept, and what are the dangers, if any?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's basically the idea that, and this started really with PayPal, and there are probably stories you could tell where there are other companies that had that similar kind of growth trajectory. But right at this time, the early web, right, you had companies that were growing, quote unquote, virally. So with PayPal, right, like the way it worked is you would, open an account, and they would give you $10 in your PayPal account of real money, and $10 to refer somebody else. So you could get $20 in real money that you could use to buy stuff on eBay, and that created this incentive for people to encourage their friends to sign up, and also anytime somebody pays for something with PayPal, that creates a further incentive for somebody to sign up. So you have quote unquote viral growth, and basically starting there. Basically, businesses were able to grow much more quickly than businesses had ever been able to grow anytime in human history. Investors saw that as really valuable, and inevitably, right, you have all these like engineers who are into optimizing things, try to find ways to kind of goose that and grow even faster. And that's growth hacking. All it means is just like doing something to make it grow faster. But of course, this can like very quickly lead you into kind of like ethical things. And growth hacking often implies like not necessarily anything that's like, super evil or anything, but it's more like
it's like incentives, right? It's
trying
incentives.
to manipulate Google to like send more customers your way, or manipulating incentives. And often you have companies that are kind of like these smaller players that are sort of trying to find little tricks to either draft off a bigger player and steal their customers or whatever. And that is growth hacking. And there are sort of like really benign versions of that, and maybe more like malignant versions of that where companies in the past have gotten into spam, right? They buy a big list of emails and like sign everybody up for your email list. Like that would be bad. But I think what I think is kind of the reason I talk about it in the book, and the reason I think it's important, is like that ethic of just like, let's grow as fast as we can, as quickly as we can, sort of norms and ethics and so on be damned. That I think is maybe okay when we're talking about a tiny company, and it starts to get a little bit terrifying when it's playing out, at the scale of a bigger company or like a startup that is backed by like billions of dollars in, like foreign money or something. Uber, right, was like a startup that I think was doing growth hacking, right? And I think there were times where they, clearly like where they had, all this, money from investors. I mean, I said foreign money. It's like a combination, right, of U.S. money and money from SoftBank and so on.
And
but
VC,
yeah. But anyway, they're like spending just enormous sums of money to acquire a user base, and along the way, breaking, laws in like cities or around the world, and undercutting, of course, like taxi medallion owners, but also workers, and like it just has the potential, right, to like mess up the world in ways that you don't anticipate. And so I think like with a lot of these, a lot of the kind of like Silicon Valley playbook, and that's the playbook that I think Thiel developed. I think like it's not like inherently bad or anything like that. It's just, and in fact, you can sort of see why it's useful to an entrepreneur or a leader, at a relatively early stage. Like I think we kind of all agree that, entrepreneurs, somebody who's a startup small business owner maybe doesn't need to like cross every T and dot every I, like, or maybe we can forgive them for that, right? But like when it plays out across a company like Facebook, right, which has 3 billion users and 1.5 trillion dollars in market value, and is like the biggest media platform in the history of the world, then it starts to get a little bit scarier, at least scary to me. And I think, or just has more potential to cause disruption, right? And then of course, like there's some people who see that disruption as a good thing. And that's the Facebook philosophy, right? That's when they talked about, move fast and break things. That's the Facebook motto. That is, that's basically saying like, the world's messed up, and we're gonna break stuff, but the thing we make in its place is gonna be better. And I think that's kind of like Thiel's view, right? Thiel thinks that like, institutionally, like things are a mess, and like, if we have to break a few eggs like along the way, we're gonna create a better future. And I think that view, of course, I can understand why people feel that way, but I mean, but that view, of course, can very quickly, kind of spin out of control, and can create an ethical framework that makes almost anything possible.
Well, it's one of those things where I can see, and I, as a person who takes, and I'm sure you do too, ethics very seriously, I'd want to think about any growth hacking and make sure it kind of passes a test. But you're right, something intuitive about it making sense in the startup days. But again, when you have 3 billion users, like, are you still growth hacking? Because there is a natural life cycle to a company, right? And we all think our companies are going to last forever and ever and ever. But there is this tremendous appetite for growth. And church leaders feel it, Max. Business leaders feel it, where we're like, if we're not growing, we're dying. And, it's a really good check, I think, in our conscience to say, okay, but are the methods sustainable? Are the methods ethical? Are they fair to society? Which leads me, to another question. Actually, I'm going to hang on to that question. I want to go to surveillance capitalism. So that is something you raise in the book. One of the companies that Thiel started is a surveillance technology company. It sounds very Big Brother-ish. But I mean, I listen to Yuval Harari and look at some of the stuff that he's written. And I mean, we'll talk about AI and that. But do you want to just define for us what surveillance technology is, and then what the implications are? We're in it already. We probably don't even realize that we're in it. But like, what is this part of the matrix that we're talking about?
Yeah, indeed. So there are a couple of different things. I mean, Palantir is a defense contractor primarily, although they do some work. So they're primarily, working with U.S. government and U.S. allies. But they also do some corporate work. And like the main thing they do is data mining. So, and that can be, that could be very mundane, right? That's just like, let's look up some information that's buried in our database. And a lot of what Palantir does, is super mundane, right? It's like companies that like need to project like how many, widgets they're going to need in Q2 or something like that, right? And so you gather all this data, which is maybe in a bunch of different places, and you write some software. Palantir will, help you figure out what software to write and charge you, handsomely for that. And then hopefully like create a situation where like you can do better at projecting your demand or supply or whatever. And like, all right, that's like the mundane version of it. And I think that, and then there's like, a version of data mining that starts to get like creepy, and it can actually get pretty creepy pretty quickly because, of course, like we're creating, a huge amount of data about ourselves and our loved ones all the time. There was a really great story written in the New York Times years ago, Times Magazine, about how Target, could predict who is pregnant. Based on their shopping habits, right? Which sounds kind of crazy, but of course it's obvious, right? Because if you're pregnant, you're buying diapers, you're buying diaper cream, or whatever, maternity clothes, and yet that's like really personal. I mean, and there are lots of things that are very personal that we are kind of like unwittingly disclosing to to companies on the internet all the time. I have a Gmail account, right? Gmail has, all of my, emails from the last 20 years. And it's this like, if you knew what you're doing, right? You wouldn't just know like who I sent emails to. You could develop like a very sophisticated portrait of my psyche, and you could say when I was depressed, and right. I mean, and so it's like everything I'm ashamed of is in there, every embarrassment is in there, my deepest hopes, my deepest dreams, and so on. And so that can be, of course, it could be used by the government, right? And there's the prospect that data mining could be used in a way that would violate people's civil rights. But it could also be kind of monetized, right? And that's where now this, I'm going to move away from Palantir for a second, and that's the critique of, say, Facebook or something like that, where they're gathering these like deep emotional and psychological profiles of us and effectively selling that to advertisers. And I think that makes people, feel uncomfortable. And I think rightfully uncomfortable. And I think there's the kind of civil rights question, which is like, okay, like how should we find a way to like manage how much data companies can get? Should we find a way to manage how much data the government can get? Because right, a lot of this stuff, especially with Palantir is just writing software. The government is the one that would be potentially using it, and so they're both actors in this. But then there's also like maybe the deeper, and I mean, I think this is probably just as important, like what it does to us on an emotional and psychological level to live in a world where we're always being watched. And that I think is what's kind of scary about a lot of this stuff. It's not that like the CIA is going to read my Gmail. It's that maybe like I won't write the thing that I really want to write to my wife or to my kids or on my computer, right? Like just on my own, because I'm afraid that somebody's going to read it. And that is pretty insidious. And like when people who talk about what it's like to live in totalitarian societies, like that's what they talk about. It's that you stop being free, like your thinking isn't even free because you're afraid to and so that's the fear, right? That like when we give companies all of this data and when we create ways for them to use it and permission structures where it's okay if they use it, like we're not just violating privacy or whatever, but we're giving up a little piece of ourselves. And so anyway, Thiel has played a big role in that. And of course, Zuckerberg has played a role in that. But as I talk about in the book, there's, in some ways there's been sort of a backlash to that. And Thiel, despite having played this big role in developing this world, has also criticized it at times. So I think there's certainly like potential for criticism and for and reform possibly.
A couple of questions popping out of that. One is, most of the people who listen to this podcast are content creators or business leaders in some way or the other. And all of us want to know more about the people we serve, the people in our church, the people who eat at our restaurant, who work out at our gym, who buy cars from us, who, sell homes through our company, whatever our business happens to be. We're very interested in getting to know our clients better, partly mixed motives. Number one, we can serve them better, but number two, we might also grow and become more profitable, et cetera. But I think you make the argument, like I used to do polls when I was preaching regularly, and I would just say through SurveyMonkey, hey, what are you struggling with? And then I would bring those ideas into the message. And, I think I'm a better pastor as a result. is there, in your view, an ethical line about where you draw it? I know that's like an unanswerable question, but I'd just like you to play in that for a moment and say, like, where is the line on that? Because we've all had the experience. It's like, hey, I wonder if we should buy a new car. And then you're like, oh, I don't want to see car ads on my phone. I just said that out loud. Are they actually listening? Are they not listening? Or you Google new cars, and next thing you know, all the ads are about new cars. And you're like, leave me alone. Like, where is that line?
Well, I mean, for me, and I'm not like totally against all of these technologies. I think they've, as you say, like they've made things better, and there are things that are possible today. Thanks to social media and thanks to data mining, frankly, that like weren't possible. So it's not like all this stuff should go away, or I don't think we'd be better for it. But I just think that when consumers understand what's going on, like that's a pretty good, and not understand because like it's buried in 0.35 of a 400-page privacy policy that literally no one reads, but understand it on an intuitive level when they're using the service, that this is what's happening. Like I think that's the line, and if a regular person would be confused or would feel violated if you explained it to them, then I think you're doing something unethical, and you should do it different. And I think a lot of tech companies have basically failed that test and failed it over and over and over again. But again, like there are best practices. People talk about opt out versus opt in. Like this is like a really simple one, right? If you're going to ask somebody to give up a little bit of their privacy, they should have to make that active choice. It shouldn't be like I can choose to be private. You should be choosing to be public. And again, like that's something that all these tech companies did not do initially, right? It was always like opt out rather than opt in. But that's something that you see kind of like best practice type thing. And I just think like privacy policies that are simple, that regular people can understand, explaining to people how their information is going to be used. And I mean, clearly, like this is not easy because the European Union, of course, has like created this structure around cookies that we're now kind of like we all have to sort of deal with,
like,
except cookies, right? And it's so confusing, and like obviously that doesn't get there. I do think like some of the things that Apple has done around there. Now, of course, there are a lot of people have a lot of reasons to criticize Apple, and we could talk about that. I mean, they're definitely not beyond reproach, but I think like the way that they are communicating around privacy is smart, where like you're using the app and and this is Apple, I think, forcing the companies to do this, and they're saying, hey, you're being tracked outside of this app. Do you want that to happen? And forcing these app developers to adopt better privacy standards and stuff like that. I think that's pretty good. And I just think it's really just a question of like, would a regular person understand it and think it's okay? And if the answer is yes, then you're probably on the right side of things.
Yeah, as a consumer. I've asked this question myself because I run a digital company and we do a lot of things that you're talking about, right? That's how I connect with people: email, text, podcasting, etc. And hopefully, on my good days, I have a genuine heart to serve. I hope most of my days are good days. Like that's why I'm doing this at this stage in my life. But, you also think I'm just tired of being tracked. There is no opting out though, right? Like I know one guy who had friend of mine who's not very tech. He has like a phone and that's about it. Ended up with someone else on his mortgage because you're in some public database somewhere. I mean, short of living in the woods off the grid with no technology, we're probably all in this somehow, right?
100%. And I mean, and to get out of it, as the question implies, right? You have to go so far, like you don't want to like miss out on pictures of your grandchildren. Like you don't want to, like, I don't want to, I've got young children and like, the school shares pictures, I want to see those pictures. Like and so like I think the technologies themselves are unavoidable. And what we can do is basically protect ourselves. Like this is kind of like personal, like, approaching things that we see on social media with skepticism and all that. And of course, there are companies out there that are more privacy forward. So there's Signal, it's a messaging platform that competes with Facebook and so on. And Signal it's a nonprofit. They don't have ads. There are I use an email provider, in addition to Gmail, called Helm, that is another one of these kind of like privacy forward companies. So like this is like a market need, and there are companies that are meeting it, but like there's no getting out of it. And I mean, that's what actually makes this thing so hard to regulate, because, and that's why like, I don't really know. People talk about like, oh, well, we're the society, there's a backlash against tech companies and regulations companies. It's not really clear what they would do because Facebook, for instance, is just so embedded. It owns the 3 biggest messaging platforms. It's like, I don't know how you regulate it in a way that kind of undoes the stuff that makes people uncomfortable. So I think but there are probably things you can do, and then there are, of course, things you can do as a consumer. You can choose to use services that are better on privacy than others.
Which leads us to the heart of the dilemma. I mean, I have followed tech for years, and it's just, I don't know, a passion, hobby of mine, lots of devices, etc. But one of the things that's hit me, particularly around the subject of AI, there's so many ethical questions, so many philosophical, and I would suggest theological questions around AI and technology. And I'm seeing a few philosophers, but I'm not seeing a ton of theologians weighing in on this space. And a good example, I forget what podcast it was. It might have been Tim Ferriss. It was something else, but I almost never miss a Tim Ferriss episode. But it was about like self-driving cars. And imagine, I think it was Tristan Harris was being interviewed. And imagine in your new EV or electric vehicle, you have this mode and you have to choose on setup when you're setting up your car. Do you choose altruist mode or do you choose selfish mode? Altruist is, the classic, there's an 80-year-old lady crossing the street. Do you kill her and save your family? Or do you sacrifice your family and save her? I mean, those are really great questions. And right now, human beings are making those questions. And most of us would probably choose selfish mode as much as we know the correct answer is save the sweet old lady. But you might have to program that into your car. And
right.
Conversations like that's a real simple version of some very complex issues. I would love you to know, like, how many philosophers, theologians are making these decisions? How many engineers are making these decisions, and business people? Like, it's just, to me, there's just a void. I don't know, Max, what do you think?
Zero
philosophers.
Theologians. I don't know. I think it would be really good if there were a few. And I'm probably wrong, right? Because
you've done a deep dive.
Well, there's so much money, sloshing around tech companies that I think some of them like do have like chief philosophers and things like that. Although I'm not sure like how much sway they have. And like in the case of Tristan Harris, right? He was like, I think his job was like some digital ethicist.
Yeah, he was the ethics
right. But like
guy
the whole point is no one listened to him. So there's the question of like, are these people around? And I think they are. And like when the rubber meets the road, sorry about the metaphor, do we listen to them? And I think the answer right now is no, unfortunately. And I think that and that's kind of that's what's kind of depressing and maddening about following a lot of these companies is that they have acquired a lot of power. They're making more money than any company and than any company in history, and yet they're a lot of times seem to be making decisions that are really focused on kind of like short-term bottom line stuff. I do think these are hard questions, though. I mean, there's this thing you're talking about with self-driving cars, right? It's playing out with Tesla right now, where Tesla has put this kind of very early, quote, they call it self-driving, but it's kind of like a driver assist system. And the driver assist system has made some mistakes and people have died. And the company has argued, getting to, full self-driving mode is ultimately going to save a lot of people's lives. So therefore, it's worth it. And I think that's like I don't like it's kind of weird, right? That decision is being made just like by a private company and like you said, by some engineers. And I do think there is a feeling like a lot of these technologists, for most of the time that I've been following the tech industry, it was very fashionable to like, and continues to be fashionable to like diss liberal arts majors or whatever, like, and diss people who read, philosophy or or like, there's nothing to be learned from being a humanities major. And of course, the comeback or, a counterpoint is that, I think we could probably benefit from some of that thinking. And that, and one of the, like, it would have been great if Mark Zuckerberg had just like taken a few more art history classes, I know that he doesn't feel that way, but like, I don't know, you're sort of tempted to say something like that. I also, like, I would push back on the idea that most people would choose the kill the old lady mode. And I think that,
I don't think you could if it's explicit.
Right. And I think like, that is actually kind of like one of the dangers of AI is that like it brings like kind of cold, like that. I guess what I'm saying is that I think a lot of us, if we were confronted with an ethical dilemma in real time, will make the correct decision. And like if we and there's a risk in giving that power to an AI or to a piece of software that kind of assumes things about human nature that aren't necessarily true. And I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of whatever, of that choice. And I would hope that, we would trust that people would make good decisions.
Well, I would like to take the altruist mode, and I think I would. But you don't know, right? Like in the instant, it's funny. You're bringing to mind something that happened to me years ago. When there was no technology in cars, it was basically an engine. So this is in the 90s. I'm driving to seminary with my wife. She is 8 months pregnant. It's winter. We're north of Toronto. Traffic's a mess. So we're taking some side roads. I go down this really big hill and I see a school bus stopping in front of me. I'm way back there and I touch the brakes and all of a sudden I realize, oh, this is not stopping. And all of a sudden, I see the school bus in front of me. So it's 2-lane road. I see the school bus in front of me. I'm like, if I hit that, I could hurt school children. I see a transport truck coming fast up the hill, trying to make it up the hill. If I cross into the opposite lane, I'm going to hit a transport head on. There's already, I think it was a Camaro off to the side of the road on the right. I'm like, who do I hit? And finally, I'm like, okay, I'm going to make for the left ditch. So I veer in front of the transport truck, intentionally put my car into the left ditch, and we clear it, and the transport misses the mirror on my wife's side of the car by about an inch. She's still terrified, but it was like instant ethics, right? And I'm like, what do I do? And it's like transport truck, school bus, car, pregnant wife, one empty lane. And I don't know, it was so fast. It happened in like 2 seconds. And fortunately, that was the right decision in the mode. But like we are programming that stuff into cars right now.
Yeah.
And everything else, in our technology. And it's fascinating to me. And to be honest, as somebody who's on the inside of the church, I would hope we have theologians who can speak into that, but I don't know that we do. And it's like, guys, we better study hard. Like this is really big stuff. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And
I do think that, some of this is just like natural, like development where this was an industry that, as I said, was kind of, sort of on the side of everything. They were a bunch of radicals, overturning the system. And I do think that, they will slowly, hopefully, bring more of that thinking into the design of their products. And I think people, like Tristan Harris and others, hopefully are part of that and part of like getting that conversation going.
Oh, that's good. Okay, let's talk about AI. And again, whole other podcast, whole other books, blah, blah, blah. But I'd love your view based on, 15, 20 years of studying this. Benevolent or malevolent view of AI?
I mean, I think that it's important not to like make these technologies more mystical than they actually are. And I think that AI is scary and could be malevolent, and it could be, whatever. I'm like, I have all the same concerns that a lot of people who are worried about AI. Peter Thiel is a big AI skeptic, right? He talks about how basically AI is totalitarian. Like you get
so
this,
is Elon Musk.
world.
Very skeptical.
Yeah, and for a different reason. Because so Thiel's sort of worried that AI will turn us into like communist China or something, and Elon Musk is worried that that the AI will like try to solve the spam problem and just decide to murder all of humanity to do it, or make some kind of like foolish decision that's based on like a very narrowly assessed goal or something like that. But I think that like we tend to kind of like overrate the potential of like the most extreme things that are going to happen, and then kind of like underrate like the smaller ways in which like it could potentially help us or potentially hurt us. And I think like when we talk about artificial general intelligence, like I think that stuff is like really a long way away, and I know there are people who will say other things, but I think like you really have to make some pretty big leaps in terms of like our understanding of how like the brain works and things, like leaps that haven't happened yet. But I do think that AI is kind of dangerous in a more like immediate way, in that it ends up like kind of amplifying the worst human impulses. So you design an AI algorithm that's like, you think of an AI algorithm as being like a neutral thing, but an AI algorithm is just going to reflect the biases of that we all bring to it. And so you worry, right, that we end up that like, let's say we just AI is playing a bigger role in hiring right now. Like big companies use it to like filter who they're going to interview and to assess candidates and things like that. If you just took a snapshot of where we are now and gave it to an AI and had the AI make all the, like, that would be bad, right? Because we would sort of like bake in all our biases. You would think it would be meritocratic, but it wouldn't be. It would just be whatever biases we brought to it, today. So I don't know. I think like we just have to be both skeptical of AI's, like, of the capabilities of software, because software really just like reflects the people who wrote it. And I think, but also like not be like overly, panicky either, because like, again, like the kind of like doomsday scenarios are pretty remote and maybe a little bit overhyped.
Well, and Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger and people like that have a far more benevolent view of AI. They don't see it as the threat that other people do, which is interesting, and some of the good that it's doing in the world.
I find that, yeah, and I find honestly like what they're saying to be a little bit scary, quite frankly, because their argument, the Schmidt argument, is sort of like AI, like China is doing all this stuff with data, and it's like creating this like crazy AI enabled society, and so to compete with China and make sure we don't turn into them, we need to invest in our own AI and data mining and things like that. And it to me, it feels like an argument that's like, we like, this thing is so dangerous that we need to become just like it. And that I think is really is weird and just raise a lot of red flags for me.
No,
like,
I hear
if you think
what
that
you're
data
saying.
mining is scary, then I don't think the answer is more data mining. And that's kind of what Eric Schmidt is. Maybe I'm being unfair to him, but I kind of think that's the argument.
That's a fair interpretation. On the other hand, if you look at what AI can do, not AGI, but AI can do in terms of, drug development, for example, right? And my wife's a pharmacist.
Absolutely.
And so generally what's speaking, and here's the simple example, I don't have a medical background, right? But you go into a lab, we're going to try to, play with these proteins and this sequence, and 4 o'clock rolls around, you've accomplished nothing except this doesn't work. And AI can go through that so quickly. And they've actually now got medications to market that are AI enhanced. Even my writing, Grammarly, if you're wondering what AI is, that's Grammarly. If you use Grammarly, it's like, it gives me a little report card on my tone every week. It's like, you were frustrated this week, or you were happy this week, or whatever. So it's
oh God,
around.
That is horrifying. I guess as a writer,
it is horrifying, isn't it?
But it's funny. Sometimes I think a lot of this stuff, when we call it AI, where like you could just call it software, and like,
Sure,
and if you call
sure.
it software, it's not as, it doesn't have this kind of like doomsday quality to it. It's just like it feels more normal and less like we have to choose between, you know, like a Big Brother future and one that isn't. And I totally agree that like that, you know, that software and artificial intelligence, machine learning have like, you know, are doing amazing things in the world. And like, you know, when I think about like, you know, my book has a lot of skepticism about tech and about Silicon Valley as it's constructed, but I am like super optimistic about tech too, because like, you know, we just lived through, you brought up drug development and like the development of these vaccines.
And now
you know,
a pill, theoretically.
and
right?
a pill, faster, you know, basically doing this, you know, faster than had ever been. You know, that at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was like, oh, this is going to take 5 to 10 years. And we got it, you know, and they got it done in a year. And like, and that's a credit both to like politics and political will and, you know, Operation Warp Speed and so on, but also, you know, science and in particular science powered by the technologies that we've developed over the course of, you know, the last 70 years.
Max, I'll tell you, it's so interesting. It sounds like getting to know you a little bit over this interview. You have ended up in a very similar place to me, which is like in the middle. It's like I see the bad side, I see the good side, and I'm not sure I'm going to go live off the grid in the woods right now. So here we are. What do we do with it, right? Before we leave you at crypto, and let's talk about blockchain technology. We've been diving into Web3 a little bit on this podcast. Any thoughts on how far off that is? And again, the changes that we should be preparing for as leaders?
So I feel like we were talking earlier about, okay, well, how do you fix the things that are broken with social media, with these big technology companies, Facebook and Google? And obviously, like one answer to that is, you know, decentralization. Like you could create, and there are people trying to do this right now, you know, basically the equivalent of Facebook, you know, on the blockchain or something, where instead of being tied into this one network that's controlled by you basically like a corporate dictator, you know, Mark Zuckerberg controls Facebook, it controls the board, and you know, is not. It's decentralized, and there and you would have sort of different ways to like reach audiences and stuff like that, and that would be enabled by blockchain. And in the same way, I guess you could think like crypto is like a decentralizing force in finance, where instead of these big banks and financial gatekeepers, you have kind of a free for all. And I think that's pretty cool, right? I'm as somebody who, you know, has followed, you know, the history of open source, and you know, like it's like that those ideas have been kind of floating around the internet basically and Silicon Valley almost since the beginning. The thing is though, they've lost every time. So like maybe Web3 will be different. And of course there are ways, right, that they didn't lose, that, you know, like
WordPress is always open source-ish.
Right. There's, you know, the sort of forces of decentralization have sort of been fighting against, you know, corporate centralization and, you know, monopoly capitalism or whatever you want to call it, pretty much since the internet has been around, and even before then, you know, where you had like open source software versus Microsoft or whatever. And I think you can, it's not like even if like Facebook or somebody ends up owning a lot of like Web3, like you maybe you would still have a lot of value created and you still achieve some of these goals. But I do think that's the, you know, the risk and like the you know, with crypto, of course, like right now, like mainstream, you know, banks and stuff are of course, you know, pushing into this world, and they're not just going to sit still and like, you know, let some random DAO and, you know, Goldman Sachs or whoever is not just going to like turn over, you know, the entire function of their business to like some dudes on the internet. And it's the same thing with Mark Zuckerberg, right? Like and we see it happening, you know, already, where like Facebook is, you know, wants to do the metaverse, and, you know, so I do think there's a real risk that these decentralizing technologies, you know, just end up getting appropriated by big companies. And that doesn't, and maybe that's not even a risk, right? But that ends up looking, you know, very different than like kind of what the like ideologues, or sorry, what the people who really buy into like the ideologies believe and what they espouse. And so I think that's going to be really interesting. And I also think like, if you're trying to find some kind of way out, some kind of way to have sort of like sort of Facebook-like distribution without Facebook, then, Web3 offers a possible solution. And probably most importantly, right, it offers competition, because right now there's no competition to these kind of big monopolistic tech companies. And so maybe in the end, like, these Web3 things don't do everything that the most fervent believers think they're going to do, but maybe they press Facebook and these other players to be to change, and hopefully that'll create new energy that'll make us all like enrich our lives and make us all happier, richer, whatever. So I'm like kind of optimistic about that, and I'm also just sort of optimistic about this kind of like new culture. I mean, it's like crypto is like an emerging, it's obviously it's a financial thing, but of course it's also like this weird cultural movement. And I think that's super interesting. And I think the prospect for like, new things to be created, like it's always interesting. It's like what the technology industry is about. And I think, we need to be smart about how we meet those new structures and everything. And, of course, like one failure, I think, of society, in retrospect with kind of like Web 2.0, which is like, Facebook and so on, was that we were slow to see the ways in which they were, breaking the rules, messing up society. And like, hopefully we will be quicker this time around to understand the ways that like crypto and, obviously in crypto in some ways poses a threat to the global financial system. Like that's going to have to be managed. And these Web3 things probably will present threats to, to social cohesion and all that stuff. And that'll have to be, understood and managed and confronted in the long run.
Well, this has been fascinating. Any final word on the future for leaders who are listening? I feel like we've kind of went in a lot of different directions, and in many ways, this interview has summarized a debate that's been going on in my head for years now. And yeah, there's no black or white. There's not like, here's the solution, right? It's just these are things we're navigating and we're doing it every day. Final word, Max?
I feel like people tend to... you see a lot of pessimism about the future. And, one of the things, like in the book, I talk about this, but Thiel's famous for saying, we were promised flying cars, we got 140 characters. And it's kind of easy to look at, the state of technology in recent history and get depressed and like miss the things that actually are good and miss the way, like, and you brought up one, right? Like drug development, and but there are lots of ways in which technology has like made our lives better, and that like we don't need to think, we don't need to see the future and technology as being this kind of like unsatisfying mess. It's like I don't know. There's just like so much potential and so much excitement, and like as like skeptical as I am of a lot of stuff on the internet. Like every morning I go on the internet and I'm delighted and surprised and I learn new things. And so I think it's like important to remember that, that there's still a lot of good to be discovered and built and experienced.
Well, whether you like it or not, we're here, right? Here we are. We got to lead and live in this context. So Max, you write for Bloomberg, and tell us a little bit more about the book and where people can connect with you online.
Yeah. I'm a writer, editor at Bloomberg Businessweek, author of The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. And you can buy that, wherever books are sold. And I'm on Twitter, at Chafkin, Chafkin. And you can find me there. Happy to engage further, if anyone has questions or whatever.
Oh, that's fantastic. Max, can't thank you enough for taking time for our leaders today. Thank you.
Thanks, Carey.
Thanks for watching the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I hope today's episode has helped you thrive in life and leadership. And head on over to CareyNieuwhof.com. You can join millions of leaders over there who access articles, the home for this podcast, and a whole lot more. And I send out a daily email to about 85,000 leaders with a short tip, a little insight, strategy, or something to help you in your leadership journey. Check that out, and you can subscribe for free today. We'll catch you next time on the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube.